Hello, I am Mrs. Leonard, and this is the video for latitude and longitude notes that we took on Tuesday, September 19th. We're going to go through the input page, and this page should be set up on page 7. You should have the title. And our objective for this is that the student will be able to plot locations if you are given latitude and longitude coordinates, and state the latitude and longitude coordinates if you are given a location. So you can pause the video if you need some time to write that in your notes. I'm going to move ahead and tell you a little story. A lot of people don't realize that before we had cell phones, or before we even had GPS units, in the 1600s and earlier, sailors were able to navigate and figure out where they were going on the oceans without any of that kind of technology. In fact, they didn't even have maps. The early sailors had no maps. They didn't even know where land was. They would go off and they were trying to find land. So how did they know whether they were going north or south, east or west? And how did they know how to get back to land from there? Well, they used the stars. So they would use a particular star called the North Star, Polaris, and they would use that to help them figure out where they were in the ocean. Because if you were to look up in the sky, and depending on how high that particular star is in the sky, that will tell you what your latitude is. And then the other thing that they used to help them figure out their position, their location on the ocean, believe it or not, was a plain old clock. And they could use a clock to tell what time it was where they left. So for many of them, they would leave England, or maybe they left China, or maybe they left Africa, and they would leave, and if they had a particular clock set to whatever time it was when they left, so let's say it was the time like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then as they traveled, time would go on, but if they knew what time it was where they were at, because time is different depending on where you are, because of time zones, and sailors would figure that out from the sun. So they would look and see, oh, okay, the sun is directly above me, and so I know it must be noon, right? 12 o'clock noon, that's when the sun is the highest in the sky. So they would use clocks for longitude to tell what their longitude was, and they would use the North Star to tell where they were in terms of latitude. We actually have the benefit of knowing what our latitude and longitude coordinates are, and so we use those to tell what our location is. So what is latitude? Latitude lines are lines that measure the distance in degrees. So that's what we're going to talk about first, latitude lines. They measure distance in degrees north and south of the equator. So on our little diagram here, I would highlight the equator. This is the equator. And if you can't see that word, maybe write EQ so you know that stands for equator. And so latitude lines measure north of the equator, and they measure south of the equator. And then longitude lines are lines that they also measure in degrees. They measure a distance in degrees, but this time they measure east and west, not of the equator. They measure east and west of something called the prime meridian. Now hopefully this sounds familiar to you, that you learned this in middle school, or maybe even before that. But here's our diagram of longitude, and here is our prime meridian right here. So I would highlight that, maybe put PM next to it so you know that that's the prime meridian. And then these are the longitude lines. These are measuring west, east of the prime meridian. So I remember longitude lines are long, right? So longitudes are long, and latitude lines, I would show you this. I'm going to have to show you this in class, but when you say the word latitude, your mouth kind of stretches out a little bit. If you say it, latitude. So I always remember that your mouth stretches out when you say latitude, and so that reminds me that it's a line that looks like this, latitude, right? And I always remember east and west. Everybody remembers north and south. That's easy to remember. I remember east and west because the E, if you put little arrows at the end of the E, it points east. Or another way to remember it, it spells wee, wee. If you look at it this way, or I could put a W here, wee. If I did it wrong, it would spell ew. That's wrong, okay? So that's one way that you can remember that. So